There's a paradigm shift for Central and Eastern European countries to attract the production activities of European firms, which were previously done in China. What has been the model so far? China, because of its plentiful low-wage workforce, relaxed environmental standards, and enormous potential market for goods and services, has attracted massive investments from European Union firms. There was a myth created around Chinese manufacturing as being a necessary evil, which allowed European manufacturers to reap profits while providing a high standard of living for EU consumers. That reality, as we shall point out in this paper, was quite different. Also, Chinese manufacturing operations became bigger and bigger and got to the point of believing that there was really no viable alternative to the Chinese solution in manufacturing. To defend this model, over the past 4 decades, European Union government officials, theoreticians, and practitioners downplayed the dark side of Chinese culture, some of their business practices, and some of their questionable governmental policies. The rationalization was that over time, through active engagement from the West, China would eventually converge with Western business practices, public policies, and social norms. Now, what's wrong with this model? Well, with the lifetime appointment of President Xi Jinping of China in 2018, and then the COVID-19 crisis of 2020, the notion of an EU-China convergence needs to be re-examined. The disadvantages of doing business in China are no longer acceptable. Upon surveying the members of the German Chamber of Commerce in China, we discovered that close to 25% of the firms were actively looking to relocate their activities somewhere else. What is the proposed solution? Our proposal is that European Union manufacturers should relocate their previously Chinese manufacturing activities to the Central and Eastern European nations. While they may not be able to absorb all the manufacturing currently done in China, the European Union can benefit from the long-term development of high-quality Central and Eastern European Union manufacturing capabilities. For the sake of this presentation, we would like to highlight 4 of the elements. First, there is geographic proximity between Central and Eastern European countries and the European Union. One advantage that Central and Eastern European nations have over China is their geographic proximity. There are approximately 7,300 kilometers between Berlin and Beijing, but only about 1,700 kilometers between Berlin and Bucharest. Other Central and Eastern European cities are even closer. Most goods manufactured in China travel through thousands of kilometers, pass through several customs, and are deposited in several warehouses before reaching their final Western consumers. Initially, Western manufacturers built their factories in China for the high-volume, low-value-added activities, utilizing inexpensive labor in China, relaxed environmental standards. Given the rise over time in China of their costs, manufacturers were forced to innovate in order to maintain efficiencies. Western consumers' changing expectations placed additional pressure on the European Union manufacturing in China, forcing them to adopt just-in-time manufacturing techniques. This depleted safety stocks, proving disastrous during the COVID-19 crisis. Even before the crisis, there were evidences that trade with distant nations was not as efficient as trade with regional neighbors. This led some to conclude that globalization was actually giving way to regionalization. This geographic proximity also helps with reinforcing the environmental values that the European Union wants to live by. The EU is interested in creating a sustainable energy union to accomplish its long-term climate and energy objectives. EU goals include lowering the dependence on fossil fuels, diversifying its energy supply, and creating startups to service the global market, thus creating an export-led growth. The newly integrated Central and European nations are slowly adopting European ecological attitudes and norms. In contrast, China's rapid economic expansion was fueled by fossil fuel and a very relaxed environmental standards. Environmental concerns were often dwarfed by developmental policies set forth by various governmental entities. Consumer goods sold in China can be substandard or even dangerous due to the lack of consumer safety legislation and rampant corruption among government officials. Chinese practices of opaque, inconsistent, and discouraging criticism hindered the adoption of higher ecological values and practices. This puts pressure on EU firms in China to obfuscate their actions. In contrast, Central and Eastern European nations have embraced European ecological values and are increasingly viewing them as an opportunity. Two, Central and Eastern European values are similar to those of Western European nations. And because of being integrated into NATO, oftentimes they share a common border, history, religion, culture, and economic values. They favor democracy, a free market economy, the rule of law, human rights, property rights, Western culture, and Western business structures. Since integration, millions have emigrated within the European Union, with most of them permanently and peacefully being integrated into European Union society. In contrast, Chinese business culture is significantly different from Western business culture in general. Bribery and gift-giving are long-standing business practices in China. Most Chinese see it as an integral part of guanxi, relationship building, which is essential to operate in China. However, what we found out was that bribery can often be recorded by government officials or competitors and later be utilized for blackmailing. High-profile cases are often used as public spectacles within the Chinese government who wants to prove something or punish someone. This is not to say that Central and Eastern European nations are void of corruption. However, in contrast with Chinese culture and business norms, there's a widespread agreement with Western values of integrity and transparency, and that bribes are harmful to business. Since being integrated into the European Union, many of the nations in Central and Eastern Europe have made significant progress in prosecuting corruption. Business people are increasingly conducting themselves according to European Union values. While Europe has a long tradition of agency independence and a robust checks and balances that limits corruption and increases efficiency, China does not. European leaders have been expecting Chinese business values to eventually converge with their own. Chinese leadership has been devious in promising reforms eventually, and arguing that the difference between the written rules and the operational practices should be sufficient for Westerners doing business in China. Communist China has a tradition of non-democratic values and an aggressive revolutionary ruling party that does not tolerate criticism or competition. China views business activities as being subservient to its long-term political goals. China remains a communistic, centralized economy with an ambitious and active central government and a national culture that supports this business approach. Although the European business climate allows for state involvement and labor participation, it is distinct from governmental activities. EU regulators are primarily concerned about firms paying their taxes, treating their employees lawfully, selling safe products, refraining from monopolistic behavior, and respecting environmental laws. The third issue that we would like to address is that Central and Eastern European nations are safer for Western European business than China is. Now, China began opening its economy to Western manufacturers in the late 1970s. The Chinese insisted that Westerns operating in China had to accept a local partner, and that was the price they had to pay to gain access to Chinese cheap labor, relaxed environmental standards, and enormous domestic market. Over time, Western multinationals in China realized that there were major problems associated with the cultural differences concerning private property rights, counterfeiting, transparent communication, accurate reporting, and unchangeable agreements. Central and Eastern European nations have robust, non-compete, and enforceable rules that protect foreign investors. Being EU members, Central and Eastern European nations and their governments routinely protect intellectual property and prosecute copycat producers. Central and Eastern European nations adopted a long-term perspective on business sustainability, where collaboration rather than theft is the preferred method of growth and development. In contrast, Chinese partners can and sometimes do become competitors. Chinese partners are oftentimes facilitating the development of the large Chinese market. Instead, they are all too frequent, sometimes encouraged, financed, and subsidized by the Chinese government to steal Western know-how and establish mirror competitions. Charges of deception, long-term strategies orchestrated by the Chinese government to transfer Western know-how into the hands of Chinese operators loyal to the states are all too common. Global ambitions such as Made in China 2025 support the notions that Chinese officials desire to compete globally by relying on homegrown national champions. Moreover, copycating is a deeply rooted Chinese practice in its history and its culture. Copycatting is really a way of flattering. This can be particularly detrimental for European Union firms which derive their profitability from knowledge-based goods and services underpinned by valuable brands. Knowledge-based products or services requiring significant upfront investment rely on secure and prolonged income streams from those investments. In contrast, Central and Eastern European nations respect intellectual property rights. European Union law prohibits counterfeiting goods, wholesale production, and government courts are there to ensure the intellectual property rights. As an example, in 2012, one of the best-known European brands, Lego, established a wholly owned subsidiary in Hungary which manufactured toys for the entire regions. And there has been no reports of copycats up to this point. The fourth reason is that Central and Eastern European nations are less expensive than China. China's meteoric rise has been attributed to its abundant, disciplined, and inexpensive workforce. However, since joining the WTO in 2002, the Chinese wage advantage has been slowly eroding. While low-skilled, relatively low-wage entry-level workers are still abundant in China, high-skilled workers in the Chinese knowledge-based economy are in short supply. In contrast, most CE nations have comparatively or lower wages than China. Also, there is an increased cost because there's no negative publicity against products made in Central and Eastern European nations. For instance, recent decisions by Hugo Boss of Germany and Burberry of Great Britain to exit China illustrate the potential of these costs. Both apparel brands decided to stop manufacturing in China. Industry insiders claim that the potential negative publicity concerning China's overall situation contributed to this factor. In contrast, many Central and Eastern European nations have a robust tradition of labor unions and consumer protectionism, ensuring that some of the worst offenses seen in China cannot occur in Central and Eastern Europe. Memories of the 1989 revolutions, which swept the regions and overthrew communist regimes, are still fresh in people's minds. According to some, those memories are what foster pro-democracy, pro-human rights beliefs, which ensure social and political dissident is healthy and robust. The Central and Eastern European nations have developed a good reputation for fair labor practices and an adherence to European Union laws and regulations. An interesting example is the French socially conscious clothing manufacturer Bonnet Goulet, which decided to manufacture its products in Poland because of its high ethical standards, high work ethic, and overall lower wages. So what are we to do in face of all these realities? The COVID-19 crisis in 2020 created an opportunity for the European Union to reevaluate their twin response. First, it became abundantly clear that the European Union manufacturers, which are engaged in a major risk and incur substantial losses by relying disproportionately on China. Second, the European Union manufacturers had a valid alternative to the risky Chinese investment. They could relocate their production capabilities to the Central and Eastern European nations. Although China remains an attractive market for EU goods, relocating a substantial investments in Central and Eastern European can provide the European Union manufacturers with a sound risk reduction strategy.